Alright, ladies and gentlemen, for this presentation, we're going to talk about cell division. So cell division is a very important aspect of the way living things work, because cell division is how you make new cells. Alright? So you got to think to yourself, why is it that cells of a living organism need to make new versions of themselves? Why is it that they need to be able to reproduce? And it's very important that we always think about the why when we're talking about biology and living things. So, some of the reasons that you would need to undergo cell reproduction. First of which would be growth. Right? Anytime an organism wants to grow, the cells don't get bigger. Instead, you must get more cells. So for you to get more cells, you have to reproduce those cells, which means that those cells must divide, okay? So for growth to happen, the original cells must duplicate. Next up, you need to be able to repair. So every time an organism gets wounded or damaged in any way, it needs to be able to replace those original cells. And replacing those original cells is what we would call repair. So if you get a cut on your arm, your body not only needs to stop the bleeding, but they need to then heal the cut. Well, you don't just close it back up. There were a number of cells that were damaged when that cut happened. And so your body needs to be able to replace those damaged cells. So that's the repair aspect of what this is for. Now, the other way that cell division plays a role in growth is during development. So we know that when organisms develop, their cells differentiate and become different types of cells. And so one of the things that has to happen, or one of the reasons cell division does happen, is because when these cells differentiate, they start as new cells. So that means that a original cell, typically a stem cell, will undergo cell division, and then once it's done dividing, those new cells become something new. Now, the final reason that an organism would undergo cell division is for reproduction. Now, reproduction can be complicated. In some regards, they're just going to undergo basic cell division, a process we know as mitosis. And that's for things like single-celled organism, amoeba, stuff like that. But for more complicated, or rather sexual reproduction, when two organisms are combining their genes, there's a specialized form of mitosis. And we're going to discuss that at a later date. So basically right now you have four reasons why organisms would undergo cellular reproduction: growth, repair, development, and reproduction. So let's get into a little bit about the actual process itself. So what you see here is actually known as the cell cycle. Now this is going to become very important. This is one of those terms that we have to use it appropriately. The cell cycle is the life cycle of a cell. All right, and mitosis is just part of the cell cycle. So what you see in front of you is a cell cycle, and you'll notice that there's four parts to it: the G1 phase, the S phase, the G2 phase, and the M phase. So we're going to start with the G1 phase. When new cells have been formed by mitosis, they enter what's known as the G1 phase. G1 stands for growth 1, and the growth 1, first off, the cell finishes growing. It's important to know that, like, when a cell finishes division, it's a little bit smaller than it normally would be. So during G1, the cell actually finishes the process of growth. All right, so that's the first thing that happens. It's part of the reason we call it the growth phase. The G1 phase is also when the cell does the things the cell does. So it's during the G1 phase that, like, a liver cell is being a liver cell. It's during the G1 phase that a brain cell is being a brain cell, that a heart cell is being a heart cell, that a skin cell is being a skin cell. It's during the G1 phase that the cell does its job. Now, it's important to note that some cells actually don't leave G1. All right, some cells actually enter what's known as G0, and those are cells that never undergo the division process. And those include things like some brain cells, some liver cells. They just never undergo that division process. Or if they do, it's very rarely. All right. Now, once a cell has completed the G1 phase, it enters what's known as the S phase. And the S phase is known as the synthesis phase. Okay? Now, the synthesis phase is when DNA replicates. So, for division to happen, a cell starts with a certain amount of DNA. Well, what has to happen is the DNA duplicates itself, and one copy goes to each new cell. So that DNA duplicates itself during the S phase of the cell cycle. Now, once the cell enters the cell cycle, once the cell is done with the S phase, then it enters the G2 phase. And the G2 phase is known as the growth 2 phase, all right? And we call it the growth phase because the cell grows. It doesn't really grow, but it's preparing for the process of mitosis, all right? So G1 is growth, doing your job. S is DNA replication. And G2 is when the cell is prepping for mitosis. Now, it's really important to point out, this right here is the point of no return. Once a cell leaves G1, it is either going to be destroyed by a process known as apoptosis, or it's going to complete the cell division process. That is the point of no return. Right here, between S and G1, there is a checkpoint. And the cell actually reviews all of its DNA, makes sure everything's all set, and if it finds mistakes, it will destroy itself so that those mistakes are not passed on. Okay? Now, the last phase of the cell cycle, let's finish this first. G1S, G2 together are known as interphase. And that is the phase during which the cell does its job and prepares for mitosis. Okay? Now, the last portion of the cell cycle is the M phase, which is actual mitosis itself. And that's when the cell goes through the process of division. But really what we're talking about when we say division is dividing the nucleus. And that's important because really what you're making sure happens during mitosis is that the cell nucleus and all of the DNA that's contained within it is divided perfectly between the two new cells. And so that each new cell is an exact copy of the original. So this is the life cycle of a cell, or the cell cycle. You have G1, S, G2, and M. So what we need to do now is take a closer look at M. So M is the process of mitosis. This is actually probably what you're most familiar with in terms of what you're thinking about in your memory. And mitosis basically includes 4 phases, all right? Because remember, this is not part of mitosis. This is G1, S, and G2, all right? Mitosis is the 4 phases you see right here. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, something that we refer to as PMET. All right? Now, there's lots of ways that you could talk about these. Sometimes people talk about prometaphase, proanaphase, and that's not really important because that talks about it as if there are actually like specific moments, and they're not. This is a continuous process where we just sort of say, oh, that just happened, so we passed this phase, all right? So the 4 phases, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, are how a cell gets from the beginning of the M portion of the cell cycle to the end of the M portion. So during prophase, the first thing that happens is the chromosomes actually form from chromatin. It's important that these structures right here, which are known as chromosomes, don't exist when the cell is doing its normal daily everyday stuff. They only show up during the process of mitosis. What exists normally is this, which you see in this interphase cell, and that's called chromatin. All right. So chromosomes form up from chromatin, and the nucleus of the cell starts to fall apart. All right, because you can't have the nucleus if you're going to divide all the DNA. Then as this finishes, the cell moves to metaphase. Well, actually, one other thing happens here. The centromeres duplicate. The centromere is a very important part of the cell, and it's only in animal cells, and it's responsible for cell division because it generates the spindle fibers, which we'll talk about here. Okay. So once that happens, the cell enters metaphase. During metaphase, the centromeres have actually moved to opposite sides of the cell, so you can see them here and here. And the centromeres are actually creating spindle fibers, which are cytoskeleton structures that attach to your chromosomes. And the chromosomes are lining up single file. That's going to be a very important phrase. Single file across the equator of the cell. All right, so right across the middle, right here. Okay. And then those spindle fibers attach to those chromosomes. Then during anaphase, what happens is the spindle fibers pull by shortening themselves, and they rip those chromosomes in half. But this is the thing. Those chromosomes are duplicated during the S phase. So each one of these X's is actually 2 copies of that section of your DNA. And so what happens is anaphase, those 2 copies are ripped in half. So one copy goes to one end of the cell, and another copy goes to the other end. And then from anaphase, we enter telophase, where the nucleus starts to reform around the chromosomes start to pull apart, and the cytoskeleton, actually, right here, starts to pinch off the cytoplasm into 2 separate cells. And then from here, each of those cells will enter G1, and the cycle will repeat. All right. Those are the basics of cell division.